Chapter 1. The Hunger in the Corn. The summer sun lingered low, casting a thick amber light across the cornfields outside Edevane. The stalks stood tall and wide, swaying heavy in the breeze like old men whispering secrets, their leaves curled in heat. The kind of heat that sticks to the skin and lingers, even after the sun goes down. Sheriff Ada Whitlock parked her cruiser just off the dirt road that carved through the farmland. The call had come in just past 6. No details. Just a kid screaming through the line, breathless and broken up. A name she hadn't heard in a decade, Daniel Penrose, and then something about a barn and blood. She stepped out into the late light, the dry crackle of straw under her boots. Her hand instinctively went to the flask in her breast pocket, felt its weight, and left it there. 5 months dry. Or close enough. Not the kind of milestone to ruin now. The barn sat at the edge of the property, weather-worn and leaning slightly, as if it had grown tired of standing. The roof sagged near the center, and the wide doors were pulled open just enough to see the shape of something inside, something wide and dark and slumped low. She pulled her flashlight even though the sun hadn't fully dropped. Inside, the barn smelled of old feed and rot. She stepped slowly, scanning the corners, heart pacing not from fear but from memory. She'd grown up on farms like this, learned young to hate them, the kind of places where secrets sat in corners and never came clean. Her light landed on the figure. At first, she thought it was livestock, maybe a hog, left to bloat and fester in the heat. But the closer she stepped, the more wrong it looked. Human and not recently dead. The body sat slouched in a wooden chair nailed into the floor. The man's arms hung limp at his sides, hands raw with blisters and torn flesh. His stomach had been distended grotesquely, the skin stretched so tight she could see the veins through it, branching like rivers under glass. The mouth was stuffed with husks, corn, half-chewed and packed down into the throat. Dried blood lined the lips, the chin, the floor beneath. Someone had forced him to eat until his body shut down. The name came back to her. Silas Greaves, a local from the outer farms, had a record years back for petty theft, nothing that stuck. A loner, not the kind of man anyone came looking for. Until now. Ada crouched, keeping her breath shallow. On the ground beside the chair, etched into the dirt with some crude metal tip, was a word: glutton. She stood and backed out of the barn, phone already to her ear. "Dispatch. This is Sheriff Whitlock," she said. "I need backup and corner out to 105, East Crofton Lane. We've got a murder, possibly ritualistic." The wind picked up just then, rushing through the field like a whisper too big to understand. The barn stood quiet behind her. Not a bird stirred in the rafters. No flies even. Not yet. Ada wiped her forehead with the back of her sleeve, smearing dust and sweat into her skin. Her other hand gripped the radio, the static hissing like a breath held too long. "Copy that, Sheriff," came the dispatcher's voice, filtered and thin. "Sending Deputy Strickland and the coroner now. ETA 20. She clicked the radio off and stared out at the field. The corn moved as if listening, a wide, nodding congregation. The smell was already in her clothes. Old wood, rotted grain, something sweet and sour underneath. She stepped back toward her cruiser, sat on the hood, and pulled a cigarette from the pack in her back pocket. She hadn't smoked in months. Tonight felt like the right time to restart. The flick of the lighter echoed too loudly in the silence. One drag, and the familiar burn settled behind her eyes, dulling something she hadn't realized was rattling inside her chest. "You look like shit." The voice belonged to Deputy Noah Strickland, who came crunching down the dirt drive in his dust-caked sedan. Tall, narrow-faced, barely 30, and still dumb enough to think the badge made him invincible. "I feel worse," Ada replied, flicking ash into the grass. "He's inside."
"Chair."
"Stomachs ruptured." "Corn husks." "You'll see." Strickland hesitated just outside the barn. She saw it in his posture, the pause before a man steps into something holy or profane.
He ducked in.
His silhouette lingered a moment in the doorframe before it jolted back a step.
Jesus. Yeah.
She let him sit with it a while. Everyone needed their own moment when faced with that first real body. Not a car accident or an overdose. A murder. A deliberate act of cruelty. He did this to himself, he asked. She exhaled smoke. Somebody wanted it to look that way. But look at the wrists. See the skin? Rope burns. Whoever did it made him eat. Till he popped. Strickland swallowed hard. Turned a little green. Sick. Ada nodded, her eyes fixed on the field.
There's more, she said.
Words scratched into the dirt. One of the sins. What?
Gluttony.
Carved beneath the body. Not some kid's prank. That's a message. Strickland leaned against the barn wall, arms crossed tight. You think it's tied to the old stuff? All that church fire, preacher disappearing. Ada shook her head sharply. Don't say it. Not yet. Folks don't need ghosts stirred back up. We follow the facts. He opened his mouth to reply when a white van bounced up the path, rear doors rattling. The county coroner, Miles Everett, hopped out, all bones and coffee breath. His assistant, a new girl named Jo, followed close behind, eyes wide and taking it all in with too much curiosity for Ada's liking. Where is he? Miles asked, already pulling gloves on. Inside. Don't touch the writing in the dirt. And call me if you find anything in his stomach other than corn. Miles grunted and disappeared into the barn. Jo lingered at the edge, staring at Ada. You think it's a ritual? Ada eyed her. The girl was young, early 20s, fresh out of wherever they trained people to catalog death. But her stare wasn't soft. It had shape, focus. You see a ritual here? Ada asked. Jo blinked once. The positioning, the stuffed mouth, the word. It's symbolic. That's how cults work. They escalate. Ada took another drag. It's a warning, she said. Not the ritual. And warnings mean somebody wants us to find this. Wants the show. They spent the next hour cataloging the scene. Strickland walked the field edge. Jo photographed everything with clinical distance. Miles mumbled to himself as he bagged the remains, pausing now and then to study the stomach. No external wounds, he said. Nothing visible.
No defensive marks.
Just the distension. Stomach ruptured, like it gave out under pressure. We'll know more after autopsy. Ada stepped into the barn again, crouching near the word. Glutton, still visible. Carved deep, not with care. It had been gouged in, letters uneven, frantic. Not a message, a sentence. Back at the station, the walls buzzed under fluorescent lights. Ada sat at her desk, notes spread around like puzzle pieces, but none of them fit. She'd gone through Silas Greaves' file. No enemies, no property disputes, no known affiliations. A shut-in with a bad diet and a worse attitude. But he had a brother. She picked up the phone and dialed. Hello, a voice said. Raspy.
Exhausted.
This is Sheriff Whitlock. I need to speak to Gregory Greaves. A pause. You found him, didn't you? Ada's skin prickled. Found who? My brother. Her throat tightened. Where are you, Mr. Greaves? Another pause. A sound like breathing. He told me someone was coming, the man said. Told me they were coming for all of us. Ada sat forward, pen in hand. Who's they, Mr. Greaves? But he was already gone. The line went dead. That night, she dreamed of corn growing through a man's body, stalks sprouting from his eyes and mouth, the husks whispering his name. When she woke, the taste of blood was on her tongue. The town of Edevane looked unchanged when Ada drove through Main Street. Chipped storefronts, faded banners from a harvest festival 5 years past, the pharmacy still open but barely, and the barbershop with a closed sign that was more permanent than temporary. The world had moved past this place a long time ago. And yet, it clung to itself like a dying vine, unwilling to fall. She pulled up outside the first church of Edevane, a narrow white structure with a bell tower that hadn't rung in decades. Most of the original congregation had either died or left. What was left of the faith here was quiet, bitter, and kept under the tongue like a pill not meant to be swallowed. Inside, she found Pastor Glenn Caraway rearranging hymnals with a slowness that looked more like ritual than necessity. He was a broad-shouldered man in his late 60s, with hands that looked more suited to splitting wood than turning pages. "Ada," he said without turning, "I heard. News travels fast. In a town this small, it always does." She walked slowly down the aisle, her boots thudding against the warped wood floor. Dust hung in the stained glass light. "Tell me what you know about the seven," she said. That stopped his hands. He turned to her, eyes narrowing. That's not a question a sheriff asks without reason. There was a word carved at the scene. Glutton. Caraway sat down slowly on one of the front pews. The creak of the bench was loud in the silence. "Old stories," he said. "Older than the church. Older than the town. Before my time even. Back when the land was still considered cursed by some." Cursed by what? Caraway looked up at the ceiling, as if the answers were written in the beams. "They say the land here was bought cheap, because nothing would grow. Not at first. Then something changed. The crops came in fast. Too fast. There was a price, but nobody ever agreed on what it was. Just that it had to be paid." Ada stared at him. "And the seven?" "Some say 7 families. Others say 7 sins. Depends who you ask. The idea was that certain qualities fed something that's always been buried out there. It doesn't take blood, not exactly. Just appetite." He shook his head. "It's just a story." "I don't believe in stories," Ada said. "I believe in patterns." Caraway chuckled bitterly. "Then you're already in trouble." Back at the station, Ada found a man waiting in her office. She didn't recognize him at first. Tall, gaunt, with eyes too pale for the rest of his face. He wore a gray button-down and jeans too clean for someone from around here. "You're not supposed to be in here," she said. He smiled politely. The door was unlocked. "Doesn't mean come in." He offered his hand. She didn't take it. "Name's Heath Landry. I'm what you'd call an archivist." "For what?" He nodded to the folder under his arm. "The sins. The history behind them. I read about the scene. It's starting again, isn't it?" Ada crossed her arms. "Starting what?" He placed the folder on her desk. "The cycle. Every few decades. It comes back. The 7, gluttony, envy, wrath, lust, greed, pride, and sloth. Always in that order. Always brutal. Always precise. The first is always a feast. The second, a theft. Then the fire. And so on. And you're just here to help? Let's just say I've seen the signs before." Ada opened the folder. Inside were photos, yellowed clippings, handwritten notes, a map with red circles. She recognized a few of the names. Men and women who had vanished decades ago. A waitress. A farmer. A teacher. All found in poses. All labeled with sins. "This is local?" He nodded. "And it's already too late to stop it. You can only survive it." That night, Ada returned to the Greaves property. The barn was quiet now, empty, but something about it wouldn't let her rest. She parked the cruiser and stepped out into the dark, flashlight in hand. As she walked the edge of the field, the corn didn't rustle. It breathed. That's how it sounded, like lungs inhaling just beyond the reach of light. She found herself circling, not quite ready to go back in. Then, halfway around the barn, she found footprints, bare, long, deep-set. Not from any boot. Human, but not fresh. She crouched, ran a gloved finger through the heel mark. Dry. Old. Maybe weeks. But something in her stomach tightened. The print faced the barn. She stood slowly. And then a sound. Not loud, not sharp. A low moan like wood bending, or a voice far away, behind the wall of corn. She turned, light sweeping. Nothing. But as she stood there, the wind shifted and the scent returned, sweet, wet, metallic. Ada walked back to the cruiser, hand trembling just enough that she noticed. She reached for the flask in her coat pocket.
Paused.
Put it back. Whatever this was, she'd need a clear head. At home, she sat at the kitchen table and stared at the map Heath had given her. 7 marks, 7 past sites, 7 deaths. The first was Silas Greaves. Below his name, gluttony, overconsumption, bursting. She stared at the second mark. It was a house on Cinder Street, an old home once owned by the Penrose family. She circled it in red. Next to it, she wrote, envy. And under that, they always take what they think should have been theirs. Chapter 2, the house that gazed. The Penrose house had been empty for years, but it never looked abandoned. That was the strange thing. Its windows were always clean, the yard always trimmed. No mail piled on the porch, no graffiti, no busted windows. It sat in the middle of Cinder Street like it still had a heartbeat, like someone was inside keeping things just the way they wanted them. Ada parked across the street at dawn. Mist still clung to the grass, and the wind carried the scent of a nearby bakery, warm yeast and rising dough. It should have been comforting, but the house ruined it. It was a tall Victorian, 3 floors high with an attic window shaped like a keyhole. Its shutters were painted a dusty green. The paint never chipped. A brass door knocker shaped like a lion's head gleamed as if it had been polished last night. Ada got out and stood for a moment, watching the curtains. They swayed. She crossed the street, knocking twice before twisting the handle. Locked. Good. She turned to leave, then paused. A smell hit her. Perfume. Old-fashioned, floral, clinging. It came from the mail slot. Ada crouched, flashlight drawn. She lifted the flap and peered inside. Something shifted in the dark hallway. A whisper, too low to understand, like breath caught in the walls. She stood fast and knocked louder. Sheriff Whitlock. Anyone home? No reply. She circled around to the backyard. The lawn was freshly mowed. A rusted swing hung from a birch tree, creaking slowly in the windless morning. Then she noticed the garden, rows of vegetables, too neat, too perfect. Each tomato sat fat and red on the vine. Carrots lined up like soldiers. No weeds, no bugs. She didn't even see dirt on the leaves. It was unnatural. Ada reached toward one of the tomatoes, but her hand stopped midair. She didn't want to touch it, not out of fear. Something deeper, like it wasn't hers. She stood up and turned, only to find a woman standing at the edge of the porch. Mid-30s, hair in a tight braid, wearing a beige dress that looked like it belonged in the 1950s. She held a wooden tray with teacups, 2, perfectly balanced. Sheriff, the woman said, smiling. Would you like some chamomile? You look tired. Ada blinked. I knocked. I know. But you looked like you weren't ready yet. The woman gestured to the table under the awning. It hadn't been there before. I'm Miriam Penrose, she said softly. It's been a while since we've had company. Ada hesitated, but her feet moved anyway. She sat. The tea was hot, fragrant. The woman hadn't even made it yet. You live here alone? Ada asked. Miriam smiled. Not alone. The house keeps me company. It remembers better than people do. Ada didn't drink. I'm here about your brother, Daniel. Miriam's face went blank. Not surprised. Just emptied. He doesn't live here anymore. I know. But he called in a report 2 nights ago. Said something was happening. Mentioned your family. Then he hung up. Miriam stirred her tea with a golden spoon. Daniel always wanted what wasn't his. Wanted the house. Wanted the town. Wanted to be somebody. Where is he? Miriam looked up.
He left.
took things that didn't belong to him. And now something has taken him. Ada stared at her. Are you saying he's dead? I'm saying envy is a wound that bleeds inward. You keep feeding it, and eventually it eats everything you are, even your name.
She stood.
I'll show you what he left. Ada followed her inside, through a door that now stood open. The inside of the house smelled like cedar and rosewater. Everything was spotless. Polished wood, lace doilies, a grandfather clock that ticked just a hair too loud. Miriam led her upstairs to the second floor, into a narrow room lined with mirrors. Floor to ceiling, every wall, all angled slightly inward. He made this, Miriam said, standing in the center. Daniel wanted to see himself from every angle, wanted to know how the world saw him. There were drawings on the floor.
Self-portraits.
Dozens, all in charcoal.
Some were realistic.
Some warped. In one, Daniel's head was shaped like a flame. In another, he had no mouth. In all of them, he looked miserable. Ada crouched and flipped through the pages. One of them was fresh. It showed Daniel bound to a chair, eyes wide, a hand slender, with rings on every finger, reaching toward him from the corner of the frame. Miriam watched her with a calm, eerie stillness. He envied what he couldn't understand, she said. Ada stood. And what about you? Miriam tilted her head. I tend the house. It doesn't want anything. It gives. It watches. And where's Daniel now? Miriam walked to the closet and opened the door. Inside was a pile of clothes, a belt, a wallet with his ID, and a small, bone-handled comb. Ada's breath caught. The comb was slit.
Vet.
But there was no blood, only a note, written in charcoal on the inside wall. He saw what was not his, and the house kept it. Ada stood still, breathing through her nose. The scent from the comb was floral, same as the perfume she'd smelled earlier, but laced now with something metallic. Old sweat, maybe, or fear soaked into bone. She looked at Miriam. You said the house kept it. What does that mean? Miriam turned, closed the closet door slowly. Some things you steal, some things you earn, and some things you become. Ada stepped in front of her, voice low. I don't have time for riddles. If you know where your brother is, you're going to tell me. Right now. Miriam smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. He's where all envious men go, trapped between what he wanted and what he was afraid to lose. Something creaked above them. Ada looked up. Attic. Miriam nodded. He went up, but he never came down. Ada moved past her, hand resting on the butt of her holstered sidearm. The staircase to the attic was behind a narrow hallway door. The smell grew stronger here, dust and roses and sweat soaked into time. She opened the hatch, pulled down the wooden stairs. A cold breath swept down the opening. She climbed, one step at a time. The attic was darker than it should have been, despite the daylight outside. The single window was covered in newspaper, taped carefully at the corners. The room itself was wide, sloped ceilings stuffed with storage boxes. Paintings leaned against the walls, unfinished. All of them in Daniel style. Figures bent at odd angles. People reaching for things just out of frame. In one, a man stood naked before a mirror, but the mirror showed another man entirely. Older, crueler. She stepped over a stack of canvas, her boot crunching on something. She looked down, a shattered compact mirror, and beside it, a handprint smeared in charcoal. It dragged up the wall and vanished behind a bookcase. Ada moved slowly, drawing the bookcase back a few inches. A false panel revealed itself. Behind it, another room, no bigger than a walk-in closet, and in the center, a chair. Daniel Penrose sat in it, or what remained of him. He was thin, gaunt, more bone than flesh. His face was pale, lips dry and cracked, eyes open and empty. His clothes were soaked through, but not in blood, in ink, black charcoal ink, as if he'd been sweating it out of his skin. Drawings lined the tiny walls around him, all of the same thing, the house. Every angle, every room, but the windows, every single one, had a face behind it. Not his. A different face. Feminine, wide-eyed, mouth open in hunger, and one word, scrawled over and over beneath the sketches.
Mine, 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 mine.
Ada stepped forward, hand over her mouth. "Daniel," she whispered. He blinked. She nearly stumbled back. He was still alive, but he didn't speak. He didn't move. His eyes stared straight through her, as if she were glass. Back downstairs, Miriam stood in the foyer, hands folded. "He came back here 2 weeks ago," she said. "Said the world owed him something. Said he'd prove he deserved this place." "And what did the house say?" Ada asked quietly. Miriam looked up the stairs, her voice barely audible. It listened. At the hospital, the doctors had no words. "He's alive," one said, "but it's like his mind's not there anymore. No trauma to the skull.
No stroke.
Just gone." Ada stood beside the bed and watched Daniel breathe. The only movement he made was a flick of his fingers, tiny movements in the dark air, as if drawing on invisible paper. He hadn't spoken, not a word, but they found smudges on his sheets every morning, as if he'd been writing with his fingertips in the night. Only one word, always the same. "Mine." Ada returned to the station just before sunset. Her desk was covered in files she hadn't touched. Reports of strange animal behavior near the fields.
Dead birds.
A coyote found drowned in a tree well, eyes gone. And then another envelope. No address. No postmark. Inside, a Polaroid, black and white. A girl's bedroom. A canopy bed, a dollhouse, and a mirror cracked straight down the middle. On the back, written in smudged graphite, "Pride is next." She thinks she's the only one who deserves to be seen. Ada circled the photo in red and added it to the map. Third mark. Third sin. Someone wasn't just reenacting old myths. They were staging them, and they wanted her to follow. She didn't sleep that night. Not because of Daniel. Not because of the house. Not even because of the Polaroid that now sat at the edge of her desk, staring at her like a threat that hadn't quite formed. No. What kept her up was the reflection in her own mirror. Twice, she swore she saw it move. Not her. Not her blinking late at night or walking past the bathroom. Something else, just behind her shoulder, blurred like it had stepped out of the corner of her mind.
Tall. Thin.
Watching. By 3 a.m., she ripped the mirror off the wall and laid it face down on the floor. The next morning, Heath Landry returned. She didn't invite him in, but he came anyway, slipping past her like fog, already muttering. "They always escalate after the second," he said. "First it feeds, then it stares. That's the rhythm." Ada poured coffee and stared out the window. "I need you to tell me everything."
No riddles.
No cryptic Bible school riddles. Just the truth. Heath sat and opened the old binder again. "The first time this happened that we know of was in 1891, he said. 7 families. 7 names. 7 punishments. All tied to ambition, corruption, hunger, obsession, sins, sure, but more than that. Traits. Weaknesses." He flipped to a photograph. A house burning in the background. The crowd watching wore black suits and Sunday dresses. The town used to believe this land gave them everything. They said it made the soil rich. But the cost was human. One by one, the people most consumed by their own vices were taken. And the rest turned a blind eye. Ada frowned. Why? Heath looked her dead in the eye. Because the harvest was good. She felt something hard and cold settle in her chest. So someone's doing this again. Why now? Heath hesitated. Because the ground here doesn't forget. And neither do the sins. She went back to the Penrose house just after noon, expecting it to be empty. But Miriam was on the porch, seated in the same place as before, tea steaming in her cup. You left this morning, Ada said. I always come back. You said your brother was still alive. He's not. Ada stiffened. He's breathing. Breathing isn't the same as being alive. Miriam stood slowly, holding something out. A small silver key. Ada hesitated, then took it. What's this for? The third place, Miriam said. It used to be a girl's room, but it's not hers anymore. She stepped inside and shut the door without another word. Ada stood there, key in hand, unsure whether to lock Miriam up or herself. Later that night, she sat by the fire in her small living room, studying the Polaroid again. The girl's room, the dollhouse, the broken mirror. She flipped it over. The handwriting was different than before. Still smeared, but more deliberate. She has to see herself before we can take her. That was the moment she realized what this really was. Not a killing spree. Not a ritual. This was a process. Like seed to root. Like mirror to eye. They were being witnessed. Examined. Measured. She looked up and froze. The mirror she had turned face down was now leaning back against the wall, upright. And in its reflection was not her, but Daniel, standing behind her, mouth stretched wide in a silent scream, eyes bleeding ink. She turned. Nothing. The mirror again. Only her now. But the corner of her reflection's mouth twitched. Not hers.
It's.
She backed away slowly, every hair on her arms standing upright. On the wall behind her, written in charcoal strokes, "Pride lives in the glass. You look too long. Next comes fire." Chapter 3. The Furnace Boy's Prayer. The morning after the mirror incident, Ada made two decisions. First, she no longer trusted the limits of her own perception. Second, she wasn't going to wait for the next body to turn up. It was barely 7 when she drove out to the old rail yard. Fog blanketed the edges of the river, where rusted shipping containers leaned like tombstones. No trains had come through in nearly a decade, but the tracks still glistened, like something slithered across it at night. She was here for a name. Caleb Dross. He was 16. Lived with his mother in the South Fields near the refinery line. Dropped out of school last year after the incident nobody wanted to talk about. Rumor was he'd put a kid in the hospital, something about a furnace, something about blood. And now rumor had it he was missing. Not declared missing. Not reported missing. Just not seen. And in Edevane, that was almost worse. She parked by the broken fence and stepped over curled loops of rusted chain link. The old tool shop where Caleb had once worked sat crooked, slumped from its own weight. The inside smelled like hot metal, though nothing had run in years. She found his marks scratched into the wall with a screwdriver. Anger is holy if you aim it right. The words had been underlined 3 times. She called Heath from the car. No one's seen him since Friday, he confirmed. Last person who might have talked to him was his mother. But she's not taking visitors. I'll make her take me. Heath's voice was quieter then. Be careful. Wrath isn't like the others. It doesn't linger. It explodes. Ada hung up without replying. She found the Dross house south of town, not far from the refineries. The yard was bare, but for 3 chickens and a pile of broken concrete where a porch used to be. The screen door flapped in the wind. No dog. No car. She knocked once. Nothing. Twice. Still nothing. On the 3rd knock, the door opened an inch, and something warm spilled out. Not heat, but smoke. Not just any smoke. Furnace smoke. Industrial. Pressed against her throat like a hand. She stepped in, eyes watering. The living room was full of ash. Black prints led down the hall. The wallpaper peeled. The air buzzed. "Mrs. Dross," she called out. No answer. She followed the prints, boots crunching on soot. Every surface was streaked with gray. At the end of the hallway, a bedroom door, padlocked from the outside. She leaned in, and from inside came a voice. A child's voice. Not Caleb. Younger. whispering, "Blow it all out. Burn it all clean." Ada backed away. Every instinct told her to run, but she didn't. She stepped closer, placed her hand on the doorknob. The moment she touched it, the padlock unlatched itself with a sharp click. The door swung open. Inside was no child, only black walls, a scorched crib, and in the middle of the floor, a human tooth, still warm. Outside, the sky had changed. Thick clouds hung low. Orange-yellow light bled through like fire behind glass. She pulled her phone from her coat pocket and checked the photo of Caleb that Heath had sent. Young, angry, wild eyes, grease-stained shirt, calloused hands from working the mills. She looked up again, and there he was, standing on the roof.
Nostjer.
Barefoot, arms out like wings, eyes closed. "Caleb," she yelled. He didn't move. "Caleb, I'm with the police." He opened his mouth, but it wasn't a scream. It was a roar, a sound too large for lungs. It shook the metal siding. Birds burst from trees. Smoke puffed from his nostrils like steam. He jumped, not down into the chimney, straight through the furnace chute on the west side of the roof.
Gone.
Ada ran to the side, heart thudding, boots sliding on scorched gravel. She looked down the chimney shaft. Only darkness, only heat, only the faint smell of burning fabric and skin. The chimney shaft was too narrow for an adult to fit through, but she still tried. Ada gripped the soot-crusted edge with both hands, leaned in until the acrid warmth steamed her eyes. She clicked on her flashlight. The beam caught on brick and flakes of black grease, but no body. No boy. Just empty heat and a smell she hadn't known since the fire that killed her father. Burnt flesh, like pork skin left too long on a stovetop. That wrong sweet rot. She stepped back, breathing through her sleeve. Whatever Caleb was now, he wasn't human anymore. Back at the cruiser, she slammed the door and let the AC blast her back to focus. This wasn't just about kids turning up dead anymore. This was bigger, stranger, biblical even. Heath picked up on the first ring. "He's alive," Ada said, starting the engine.
What?
"I saw him, at his house, jumped down a furnace shaft like it was a baptismal font."
Jesus, help me spirit.
Is that what this is now? A cult? Not unless fire started its own religion. She paused, then added, "I found something in the kid's room. Not his, I think. A child's voice, whispering, talking about cleansing things in fire." He was quiet a long moment. Then he said, "Ada, there's something you should know. Go. There's another missing. Not a kid. A man this time. 42. Works at the refinery. Wife found a note this morning. Scrawled in grease pen. What did it say?" He read it slowly. "I go now to feed the blaze. My rage is clean again." Ada pulled over outside St. Mere's Parish. The chapel had been gutted by a fire years ago, but the bells still rang on Sundays. It was Father Mason who kept the town from crumbling as best he could through prayer and tenacity. If there was anyone who might have seen wrath before, it was him. She found him in the garden behind the chapel, watering dead flowers. "Father." He didn't look up. "You've come for ghosts, haven't you?" She blinked. "Excuse me? They always send someone when it stirs again. You've felt it, haven't you? The heat, the pressure behind your eyes, the twitch in your fingers when someone crosses you. Have you seen Caleb Dross?" Father Mason gave her a look that chilled her more than any corpse. "I baptized that boy. Then I buried his brother." She froze. Buried 8 years ago. Furnace accident. Father left the burner unlocked. Boy crawled in looking for a lost toy. Caleb saw it happen. Burned the image into his memory. Never forgave. Not his father. Not his God. And his father? Killed himself a week later. Slit his wrists with a rusted pipe cutter. Left a note that said, "I heard the screaming long after the fire stopped." Ada pressed her fingers against her temple. Was there ever a fire like this before? One that spread through people. Father Mason wiped his hands on his apron and nodded toward the chapel's collapsed steeple. Wrath is a fire we've tried to smother before, but you can't put it out. Not when the town itself feeds it. That raged child, it's got a mouth. And now it's hungry again. Back at the sheriff's office, Heath had pulled every case of suspicious fire over the last 50 years. There were more than 30, but only 7 had a pattern, each tied to a death or disappearance, each tied to a sin. Gluttony, wrath,
Fride, envy, lust, greed.
sloth. And every one of them, every last one, centered around a specific year. Every 11 years. Ada stared at the stack of reports. What year are we in now? Heath flipped his calendar. Last incident was in 12. Ada did the math. It was 2023. 11 years. It had begun again. Later that night, she returned to the Dross house. She brought with her a thermal drone. The shaft Caleb had disappeared into was bricked up from the inside, but heat still radiated through the walls, as if something was breathing beneath the floorboards. She launched the drone through a gap in the siding and watched the monitor carefully. The camera dropped into blackness. Then heat signatures began to bloom. Footprints. Dozens. Leading underground. And then, just before the signal flickered, a shape.
Small.
Human. Sitting cross-legged in the ash. And another. Larger. Closer. A hand. Not reaching. Just resting. As if waiting for something to ignite. The drone's feed cut to static just as the silhouette turned. Ada sat still in the cruiser, hands locked on the controller like a woman in prayer. For a moment, it was as though the night around her held its breath. That kind of silence, low and ancient, never belonged in a town like Edevane. It was the hush of wilderness, of something waiting, coiled beneath the floorboards of time. Ada had felt fear before, as a cop, as a woman alone on dark streets. But this was different. This was ancestral. It made her think of old stories whispered by a great aunt who'd worn black even on good days. Stories of bonfires that whispered back and old men who bled rust. Ada wasn't religious, but something inside her whispered the word demonic, and this time, she didn't dismiss it. Back at the station, Heath stared at the drone's final frames like he was waiting for them to blink. He poured coffee that neither of them drank and pulled out an old, locked filing cabinet buried beneath years of forgotten paperwork. "I didn't think I'd ever open this again," he muttered, kneeling with the key clutched between scarred fingers. It had been given to him by the former sheriff, Emery Shaw, who vanished in 2012 after the last wave of fires. His body had never been found, only a smear of blackened soot across the station's back wall, and his badge half melted beside it. The file was old, brittle, and marked with a word burned in by hand. Redacted 7. Inside there were photos, handwritten notes, recordings, 7 names, 7 obituaries, 7 maps all circled in the same part of town, an old, condemned mine shaft 2 miles outside Edevane's limits, buried in a stretch of overgrown woodland the locals only called the Gullet. On one of the maps, in a child's scrawl, someone had written, "Team sleeps, but it dreams in fire." Ada leaned over the maps, studying the way each disappearance spiraled outward from a central point. It's not random. It's designed, like it's waking up one sin at a time. Feeding. Heath looked pale. And Caleb, wrath. He's not possessed. He's a vessel. That heat, that thing we saw on the drone, it's not after the kid. He's part of it now. They sat in silence for a while, neither willing to say the word that hung between them like a fuse waiting for flame. Evil. That night, the town cracked. It started with a scream. Neighbors called in reports of fire at the old Eldritch scrapyard, owned by Donnie Murch, a shut-in known for his rages and petty cruelty. Ada and Heath arrived to find the building belching fire from the windows. the yard itself steaming with melted car parts and blistered asphalt. The air reeked of metal, scorched rubber, and something darker, an oily tang that clung to skin like regret. Inside, they found what was left of Donnie. He'd been welded to the wall, fused into a sculpture of rusted rage, arms outstretched, mouth pried open, eyes burned to sockets. Around him, burned into the wall with a acetylene torch, were the words, "He who stokes wrath shall be consumed by it." Ada turned away, ball hot in her throat. The body wasn't just burned, it had been posed, offered, like a sacrifice. And in the ash, boot prints.
Small.
Barefoot, leading away from the fire and down into the tunnels below the yard, abandoned irrigation tunnels that stretched for miles beneath the town. They followed them until the walls began to drip with heat, until the air felt thick enough to chew, until they reached a chamber of stone and soot and silence, lit only by the orange throb of a furnace that had no origin. And there, standing in front of it, was Caleb Dross. Only he wasn't a boy anymore. He turned, face aglow with reflected heat, and smiled, a crooked, unchildlike thing. "The fire's almost full," he said. Then behind him, in the embers, something stirred. A face made of flame. No eyes, just hate. They fled. Heath didn't stop vomiting until they reached the cruiser. Back at the station, Ada sat in the dark, watching the drone footage over and over, trying to match what she'd seen to any logic, any law, any science. There was none, but there was pattern. 7 sins, one every 11 years, always ending in fire, always beginning with wrath. And now wrath had taken form. Not a spirit, not a demon, something older, a hunger stitched into the soul of Edevane itself. And if Caleb had been taken, who would be next? Chapter 4. The Widow's Death. Rain returned to Edevane like a long-withheld confession, sharp, sudden, and unrelenting. It hissed against roofs, clawed at gutters, and filled the gutters with the kind of water that remembered old sins. The town, so parched from heat just a week earlier, now drowned beneath a curtain of gray. But the rain wasn't cleansing. It was curdled somehow. Like the sky was trying to scrub something away it couldn't quite reach. As if it knew what was coming, and knew too that it was far too late. Ada watched the drops paint patterns on her windshield as she sat outside an address she hadn't visited in nearly 8 years. 115 Chapel Row, a sagging Victorian wrapped in ivy and grief. The home of Maura Bell, the oldest living widow in Edevane and the last known witness to the fire of 1978. The one that took her husband, her sons, and half a dozen others in a blaze no one could explain. The fire that started, some say, in the cellar of the old church. No one had spoken to Maura in years. Not really. She'd become a fixture of the town's folklore, rumored to feed crows from her porch, to talk to empty rooms, to curse anyone who walked too slow past her picket fence. But Ada remembered her as something more, a woman whose eyes held history and whose silence was a kind of screaming. The gate creaked open like it had been waiting for her. The garden, wild and overgrown, smelled of mint and rot. Ivy hung low like watching arms. As she knocked on the front door, the wood beneath her fingers felt soft, like it had been soaked in tears. It opened on the second knock. No voice greeted her, only the scent of old wood, rain, and lavender gone to seed. And there, in a rocking chair by the parlor window, was Maura. She looked impossibly old, the way time only carves people when they stop fighting back. Her hands were twisted into the shawl she wore, and her face had the drawn, pale serenity of someone long resigned to ghosts. "I wondered when you'd come," Maura said, not turning from the rain-slicked glass. "I didn't know I was supposed to," Ada replied, stepping into the house as the door shut behind her on its own. "Not you exactly," Maura murmured, "but someone. It always happens after the fire wakes up again." The fire? Ada pulled out the photos.
Caleb.
Donnie Murch, the furnace. Mora didn't even flinch. I saw the first one in 1956, she whispered, when I was just a girl. My father came home with soot in his eyes and blood under his fingernails, babbling about a boy in the fields who lit the ground just by walking. They thought he'd gone mad. Threw him in Greystone for 15 years. He hanged himself before they could declare him cured. Ada sat slowly, her voice quiet. And what did you see? Mora's eyes flicked to hers then, sharp as glass despite the cataracts. I saw the sins, one after the next.
Wrath, greed, envy.
Every time the fire wakes, it chooses its vessels. Not random. Not evil, not exactly. It's judgment. Cruel judgment. Old as the land. I think it sleeps between the stones. Beneath the river. Inside us. Ada's breath caught. 7 sins. 7 sacrifices. Mora nodded. You survived. No, Mora said flatly. I owed. My boys died in the 3rd fire. They weren't chosen. I was. But I begged.
Prayed.
I offered something in return. Ada felt cold. What did you offer? Mora's mouth trembled. I gave it my bloodline. Promised it would have me last, and that it could take the rest. It was the only way to stop it then. The room seemed to shrink around them. And now, Ada whispered. Mora stood for the first time in what looked like years. Her spine creaked like timber bending in wind. She moved to the mantel and lifted something small and black, a book wrapped in scorched linen. She handed it to Ada with trembling hands. It smelled like coal and salt. Inside were names.
Dates.
All lined up with the town's accidents. Fires. Collapses. Murders. Each labeled with one of the sins. A new name had just been added, scrawled in shaky ink. Greed, Jonah Barrow. Ada's stomach turned. Jonah Barrow was a developer. He'd recently won a contract to tear down half of Edevane's old district for luxury condos. She remembered his billboards, reclaiming Edevane's wasted potential. And she remembered too what happened just yesterday. He'd been found in his study, slumped over gold bars and empty jewelry cases. His throat had been torn out. No sign of forced entry.
No helados.
Just a single word carved into his mahogany desk. Consumed. Mora sat back down as thunder rolled low in the sky. It's begun again, she said softly. And this time it won't stop. The ledger Mora handed over felt like it radiated heat. Not warmth, but the kind of uncomfortable, pressurized heat that suggested something alive. Ada placed it on her passenger seat like it might scald the leather and drove away from Chapel Row in silence, windshield wipers scraping rhythmically over the roar of the storm. The clouds above were so heavy it looked more like dusk than afternoon. Back at her apartment, Ada spread the scorched journal across her kitchen table. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from a rising tide of certainty she couldn't explain away anymore. This wasn't metaphor, wasn't urban legend, wasn't grief-induced hysteria. This was real, and it was structured. The pattern in the book was clear. Every 20 to 25 years, a chain of deaths. 7, each tied to one of the deadly sins. Some names were circled. Some had crosses through them. One had her mother's name beside it, dated 1978, Lust.
She stared at it for a long time.
Ada hadn't spoken her mother's name aloud in over a decade. She hadn't dared. Her memories of that year came in flashes. Smoke rising from the rectory, blood on the porch swing, a priest's torn collar caught in the branches behind the playground, and her mother, crying in the basement, whispering to the furnace like it could hear her. Maybe it could. She flipped to the back of the book where a newer section had been added in shakier script. 2 more names beneath Jonah Barrows. Donnie Murch, Sloth. Caleb Moore, Lust.
Caleb.
That word sat like bile in her throat. It made her feel unclean.
Disgusted.
But he hadn't done anything. Not to anyone but himself. Unless her phone buzzed. A text from Wyatt. "You seen the Moore autopsy yet?" She responded with a quick, "No." "Why?" The reply came almost instantly. There's something carved into his chest. Word is, it says, indulgence.
Cops are panicking.
They want to call the bureau. Ada's legs nearly gave out. It wasn't random. It wasn't suicide. It was ritual. Her phone buzzed again. Also, something else. Weird symbols burned into his feet. Not branding. Like inkless tattoos. Can't explain it. Ada shoved the ledger into her bag and drove straight to the morgue. The receptionist at the front desk, a woman named Sherry who wore star-shaped earrings and never stopped chewing cinnamon gum, looked up from her crossword as Ada flashed her ID. "Room 3. They're still pulling data," she said, gesturing with her pen. Room 3 was cold. The kind of cold that wrapped around your teeth. And it stank formaldehyde, metal, and something sour beneath it all. Caleb Moore's body was laid bare beneath a fluorescent buzz. Wyatt was already there, hunched over a tray of notes, his tie askew and sweat lining his collar despite the temperature. He looked up at her with that same quiet dread he always wore when the world tilted slightly sideways. "See for yourself." Ada stepped forward. There, right in the center of Caleb's chest, between the ribs, carved in jagged slashes, was the word, indulgence. The letters weren't deep, but they were deliberate. Like someone had written them with a scalpel dipped in fury. She stepped around to the foot of the table. The soles of his feet were blackened, scorch marks in the shape of something that made her skin crawl. A circle, a triangle, 7 slashes branching off like rays of the sun. "You seen this symbol before?" Wyatt asked, scratching his beard with the back of a latex glove. Ada hesitated. "No," she lied. She had seen it. In a dream. No, in a memory. On the cellar floor of the old rectory, drawn in charcoal. Her mother had been kneeling in the middle of it, whispering over a bowl of something thick and dark. And the floor had moved beneath her knees, like it was breathing. Ada's hands clenched at her sides. She stared at the body, at Caleb's pale, expressionless face. He was gone, a vessel spent, the sin drained out, or satisfied. Wyatt sighed, lifting the edge of the autopsy sheet. "You're thinking what I'm thinking?" "Depends," Ada said quietly. "Are you thinking this isn't the first time Edevane's buried something like this?" He nodded, "And that it won't be the last."
Her phone buzzed again.
Another text. Unknown number. Next is envy. "You know who it is. You've always known." She stared at the screen, heart hammering. Wyatt stepped closer. "What is it?" Ada's throat was dry. "It's starting again, and it's keeping score." Ada's fingers hovered over her phone. The message glared back at her in silence, more alive than anything else in the room. Next is envy. "You know who it is. You've always known." Wyatt read her face. He always had that way. Less detective, more brother. The only person left who remembered what she'd been like before. "Ada," he said, voice low, "you want to tell me what's going on?" She shook her head, not as denial, but defense. A slow, unconscious gesture like shaking off a hand that wasn't there. "I need to check something," she murmured, and she left him there. With the body, the marks, and the smell of burnt symbols still clinging to her coat. The apartment wasn't home, not anymore. Not since the dreams had started again. Not since she saw her mother in the mirror, mouth stuffed with worms, whispering about debts unpaid and sins that bled down generations. The ledger sat open on the table. Ada's finger traced the names, the looping old cursive, the invisible fingerprints of guilt soaked into every page. She turned to the last unfinished entry. A blank line. A date. October 17th, 3 days from now. Beside it, only one word had been written so far. Envy. She flipped back to the older entries. In the 1956 cycle, Envy had been the fourth victim too, a woman named Bernice Crane, who'd poisoned her sister's tea. In 78, it had been a teenage boy who set fire to a rival shop. In both cases, jealousy that escalated to violence, and both had been found the same way, charred footprints nearby.
No explanation. No witnesses.
And in both cases, the ones who died hadn't been the sinners. They were just the catalysts. The envy had belonged to someone else, which meant it didn't matter who was next. It mattered who wanted them dead. She stood suddenly, breath short, dizzy. There was only one person who came to mind. Frankie Bell lived on the west side of Edevane in a house that reeked of Clorox, cheap beer, and desperation. She was a local artist, unofficially, more of a hobbyist of grief, as she put it, sculpting memory boxes and drawing portraits of dead pets for money. She was also Caleb Moore's ex. And not just his ex, his obsession.
It was no secret.
The whole town had witnessed it, from her restraining order to the voicemail he left the night he died, where he begged her to remember who he used to be. Frankie hadn't shown up at the funeral. She hadn't cried. She hadn't said a word. Ada knocked 3 times before the door swung open. Frankie stood there in a threadbare robe, paint streaked across her jaw like war paint, a cigarette burning down to the filter in her fingers. Her eyes were ringed red, but not from sadness, from fury. "You got a warrant?" she asked. "I'm not here to arrest you," Ada said. "I'm here to ask about Caleb." Frankie snorted, coughed once. "He's dead. What else is there?" "I think someone wanted him dead," Ada said. "And I think that someone may still be out there." Frankie's eyes flickered. He was obsessed with me, with what he thought I represented. I told him I'd moved on, that I had someone else. "You didn't, though."
Not really.
Frankie blinked slow. The air between them thickened. "Why would you say that?" "Because I think he knew you were lying. And I think whoever really wanted him dead knew it too." Frankie stepped back and let her in. The living room was chaos. Paintings of eyes in every size and shape lined the walls. Canvases stacked to the ceiling. Every one of them the same shade of green as Ada's own. She froze. Frankie caught the look and smiled, bitter and broken. "You see it now?" Ada nodded slowly. "You were in love with him."
No, Frankie whispered.
"I was in love with the idea of being someone he couldn't forget." The realization sank like a stone. "You envied the attention he gave me." Frankie exhaled through her teeth. Every damn second of it. A silence passed between them. Thunder cracked outside. Ada's phone buzzed again. One word. Tonight. She turned to leave. Frankie didn't follow. The air had changed by the time Ada reached the precinct. Something sharp was rising beneath the surface, like heat before a lightning strike. A pressure that lived inside the walls of Edevane itself. Wyatt met her at the stairs. "There's been another one," he said. "3rd floor of the old Miller apartments. Young woman. Looks self-inflicted, but the coroner says it doesn't add up. Symbol on the floor. Same one as before." Ada's stomach turned. "Her name?" she asked. Wyatt checked his notes. "Frankie Bell." Ada's legs gave out. Later that night, Ada stared out her window, unable to sleep. One more name gone. Envy had claimed its victim, but it hadn't been Frankie's envy. It had been someone else's. Someone jealous of her, of what she knew. Someone who saw her as a threat to whatever legacy this was. The ledger waited on her desk, open to the next blank page. One more word had appeared since she last looked. Greed. And beneath it, in tiny handwriting that didn't match the rest, 2 initials.
Wutze.
Wyatt Collins, her partner, the only one who knew everything. Chapter 5, A Heart Too Full. The rain had come hard that morning, hammering Edevane's rooftops like it meant to tear the whole town loose from the earth. Ada stood at the window of her office, unmoving, watching the wind warp the trees, twist the power lines, and scream down empty alleys like something wounded.
She didn't turn when Wyatt knocked.
She'd already known it was him.
No one else knocked that gently.
"You been in here all night?" he asked. No answer. He stepped closer, dripped water onto her floor. "You're scaring me, Ada." Still, she didn't face him.
Not yet.
Not until she was sure her voice wouldn't betray what she'd seen. The ledger was still open on her desk. She hadn't moved it, hadn't dared. He followed her line of sight and frowned. "You still obsessing over that thing?" "I'm not obsessing," she said, quiet but firm. "I'm following." "Following what, Ada?"
You know this is madness.
"People are dying, yeah, but this whole curse book, Sins of the Town nonsense." She turned to him, eyes sharp. "Then how do you explain the names? The symbols? The fact that every single one of the victims so far matches an entry from a cycle 40 years ago?" Wyatt's mouth opened.
Closed.
He ran a hand through his soaked hair, breath fogging slightly in the chilled air. "You sound like you've gone down a hole you can't get back out of." "I have," she said, "and you're in it with me." He flinched slightly. Not much, but enough.
She saw it.
That flicker, that crack, the initials in the ledger.
Vuce.
He swallowed hard. "What exactly are you saying?" She didn't answer directly. She stepped forward and placed the book on the table between them, letting his eyes find the word burned into the page with some hand older than theirs.
Greed.
"I don't think you killed anyone," she said. "But I think you know more than you've said.
About this town.
About what's happening now." Wyatt sat slowly, like the weight of the question had finally found his spine. And then he told her a story. "It started when I was 12, he said, voice barely louder than the rain. "My father used to go out into the woods behind the school late at night. Said he was checking the traps, but there were no traps. Not really. Just a place he called the burrow." Ada tensed. The word was wrong. It didn't belong in the mouth of a sane man. Wyatt stared into the distance, eyes going foggy. He'd take offerings out there, small things at first.
Coins.
A carving knife.
Dead birds.
Then one year, after that freak drought, he said Edevane had grown hungry. He meant something else. Something beneath. Ada had heard the stories. Children repeating nonsense they didn't understand. The burrow was myth, something the mill workers muttered about when the nights grew long and the trees howled. A forgotten place, swallowed by the woods. But Wyatt's face held no amusement. "It lives off imbalance," he whispered. "Off the things we want but don't deserve. Greed is just the spark. The fire's what comes next." She felt cold crawl up her neck. "What did your father give it?" Wyatt looked her in the eyes. "My mother." Ada stood alone in the woods behind the school that evening. The storm had passed, but the soil was soft, and her boots sank an inch with every step. The trees out here grew too close, their roots tangled like fists. The light barely filtered in. She shouldn't have come alone, but some things didn't like an audience. She followed Wyatt's directions, whispering the names of the old trails until one of them answered. The air shifted. The sounds around her died. Even the wind refused to move. And then she found it. Not a clearing. Not really. More like a scar. A wide circle of dirt, flat and dead, at the center of which sat an opening in the earth no wider than a man's chest. The burrow. It stank of wet ash and blood that had long since dried. She knelt beside it, heart pounding. "I know what you are," she whispered. "I know what you're feeding." And something moved beneath her feet. A groan.
A sigh.
Like 1,000 old bones shifting in sleep. Then silence. When Ada returned to town, night had already fallen. Lights in the windows flickered. Street lamps buzzed. And far off in the distance, she heard it again. A scream. Not a woman's. A child's. She ran. Through the alleys. Past the bakery. Across the narrow bridge that led to the old railway yards. And there, beneath the rusted frame of the bridge, she found a boy no older than 7, sobbing, barefoot, trembling beside the body of a man. The man had no face left, just blood, and a note pinned to his chest with a nail. Ada stepped forward, pried it loose. One word, scrawled in red, feast. And below it, a symbol she hadn't seen before. A perfect circle, swallowed in 7 jagged lines. The boy wouldn't stop screaming. Ada had wrapped him in her coat and radioed for backup, but Edevane PD was thin on the ground tonight. Half the force was already combing the northern ridges after the disappearance of Delilah Rokes, the 5th girl in as many weeks to vanish without a trace. The boy had no ID.
No cóż.
Just a jagged cut along his heel, like he'd run through glass or worse. "Hey," Ada whispered, kneeling. "I need you to look at me, okay? Just me. What's your name?" The boy opened his mouth, lips cracked, eyes unfocused. For a moment, she thought he wouldn't speak at all. Then he said, "Calder." "Calder." She smiled gently. "That's a strong name." He blinked at her, uncertain. "Was that your dad?" she asked, glancing toward the ruined corpse under the bridge. She already knew the answer. The man had been holding the boy's hand when he died. Calder shook his head. "Not my dad. Just the one who took me from school." Ada's breath hitched. "What?" "He said he was going to take me to the mountains. Said he was going to cleanse me." Ada froze. The words struck deep. Cleanse. She'd heard it once before. Scrawled across the margins of the Ledger of Sin, near the last recorded death under the sin of gluttony, Wyatt had brought her the page. It was buried under years of dust in the town's forgotten archives. No digital copy. No recorded victim. Just the word, cleansed. Wyatt met her back at the station later that night. His hands shook as he flipped through the old police reports, tracing names he hadn't dared say in decades. "He was a local," Wyatt muttered, poring over the witness logs. "None of these men are. They come through Edevane, never from it." Ada stared down at the note she'd pulled from the man's body.
Feast.
The symbol beneath it, 7L, lines in a circle. "Do you know what that means?" she asked. Wyatt didn't respond right away. Instead, he walked to the chalkboard on the far wall and drew it from memory, the symbol, the circle, the jagged marks surrounding it. "It's not just a warning," he said. "It's an invocation." Ada stiffened. "You're telling me someone summoned this?"
No, Wyatt replied grimly.
"I'm telling you we've been living inside it. There had always been 7 circles on the old town seal, but no one really paid them much mind. Decorative etching, they called it. A relic from the settlement's founding. But when Ada pulled the seal up and compared it to the symbols found on the bodies, a sick realization settled in her gut. Each line of the circle corresponded not to protection, but to sacrifice. 7 circles, she whispered. 7 sins. 7 offerings. Wyatt nodded, and we're halfway through. Outside, the rain started again. This time softer, almost gentle, but Ada knew better. The storm had just drawn its breath, and something in the dark was very, very hungry. The child slept in the holding room, wrapped in 3 blankets and one of Ada's old sweatshirts. He had a pale crescent-shaped scar on his chest, just above the heart, and the doctors couldn't say where it came from. "Not surgical," the ER nurse had whispered, tracing it lightly with a gloved finger. "More like branding." Ada stood outside the observation window, hands on her hips, trying not to shake. The boy, Calder, murmured in his sleep, tossing fitfully. Sometimes he muttered words, some familiar, others ancient-sounding. She wrote them down every time. A vitum, corpent.
Canto math.
When Wyatt returned with the transcripts from the Rokes girl's disappearance, he tossed them on the table beside her. "She was last seen at the old train yard," he said. "Same spot we found the body from the greed case. Same symbol carved into a rail post. So they're connected," Ada muttered. "No," Wyatt said. "They're chained." Later that night, Ada couldn't sleep. She sat in her apartment with the lights off and pored over the notes she'd scribbled across a dozen mismatched pages. They were everywhere, pinned to walls, spread across tables, taped to cupboard doors. Names, places, words and languages she didn't understand. Every murder, every child, every symbol. The sins weren't random. They were rhythmic.
Gluttony, greed, lust, envy.
Each had happened exactly 11 days apart. The next was due in 2. That night, she woke up at 3:03 a.m., gasping. A shadow had been in the corner of her room, long and thin, with shoulders too broad, arms too long, watching her with eyes like burn holes in a film reel. Gone when she switched on the lamp, but she knew it had been there. In its wake, a smell lingered, rich, sweet, almost intoxicating, like fresh blood on warm earth. By morning, she made her decision. She returned to the basement of the Historical Society alone, flashlight in one hand, service weapon in the other. The temperature dropped 5 degrees as she stepped inside. Her boots echoed on the old tile, and the walls were wet with condensation. In the back, behind a shelf of mold-eaten church records, she found it. A ledger, bound in hide, older than the town itself. On the cover, the codex of the bound sin. Inside, page after page of names, each marked with a sin, each accompanied by a year, a location, and a method. The last page wasn't written yet, but the 7 slots had been carved into the paper, waiting for ink. 3 were already filled, and the next was dated 2 days from now. Scrawled in red, envy. Ada's hands trembled as she turned the page. What she saw next drained the warmth from her spine. A sketch of a woman standing in a cornfield, staring back at the viewer. The face was hers. And beneath the image, a name had already been written in faded ink, decades before she'd ever been born. Ada Merritt, Chapter 6, The Green-Eyed Curse. Rain had returned to Edevane, soaking the rooftops in a slow, sullen drizzle that crept into the bones. It slithered down the courthouse eaves and whispered against the windows of Ada Merritt's apartment like a warning come late. The air smelled of rust and moss, like something buried beneath stones had begun to breathe again. Ada hadn't spoken to anyone all morning. The only sound in the room was the low hum of the old space heater and the soft crinkle of pages turning. She hadn't slept. The codex of the bound sin sat open across her lap, its brittle vellum pages reeking of damp and dust and something darker, something metallic. Each page bore a story, every one of them etched in that same sharp, ritualistic script, inked by a hand that had known violence intimately. Names, dates, faces that had been blotted out with thick black strokes. And in the margins, notes scribbled in what appeared to be several different handwritings over the centuries. Wyatt had gone quiet after seeing it. He'd sat across from her the night before, jaw tight, a bottle of whiskey on the table between them. "This thing," he said slowly, "if it's real, it means none of this ever stopped. It just did better." Ada had only nodded. She couldn't stop seeing her own face in that sketch, drawn in charcoal, outlined with a precision that was clinical. Not just a likeness, but her eyes, her jawline, even the scar on her eyebrow from when she fell off the porch as a child. She ran her thumb over the word beneath it again. Envy. The Green family lived in the woods west of town, past the old mill road where the streetlights stopped and the pines crept close to the asphalt. Their house was a decaying colonial, the sort of place that had once belonged to landowners and now served as a haven for rust, mildew, and secrets. Ada and Wyatt stood at the edge of the drive, both reluctant to knock. They called about their daughter, Wyatt said. "She's been acting strange since Monday. Not sleeping, drawing symbols, speaking in other voices." "What kind of symbols?" Ada asked. Wyatt pulled a photo from his coat pocket and handed it to her. She froze. It was the same symbol they'd found carved beneath the body in the greed case. a twisted hourglass shape, like a snake eating itself, wound around a broken mirror. Ada folded the photo and stuffed it in her pocket. Let's go meet her. The girl's name was Isabel Green.
16.
Thin as a breath, pale to the point of translucent, with hair like black ink and a way of looking at you like she saw something beneath your skin. She sat in a chair by the window, wrapped in 3 blankets despite the heat inside the house. Isabel, her mother whispered. Detective Merritt and Deputy Thorne are here to talk to you. Isabel didn't move, just turned her head slowly, like she'd known they were coming long before the knock at the door. Her lips curled into a small, knowing smile. You smell like the field, she said to Ada. Ada stiffened. What field? The one with the mouths. The hungry mouths. Wyatt blinked.
Jesus.
Isabel tilted her head and added softly, You're next, you know. Ada crouched down to eye level. Next for what? But Isabel didn't answer. Her gaze had drifted to the ceiling, and a slow, eerie humming rose from her lips. One of those tuneless melodies children sing when they're far away in their heads. Her fingernails were stained green. So were her teeth. That night, Ada pulled the files again. Patterns were emerging, not just with the dates or symbols, but in the emotional makeup of the victims. Gluttony had belonged to Jonah Morrell, the man they'd found in the field. Surrounded by half-eaten food and bloated to unnatural proportions, greed had been tied to Wallace Merton, a failed banker who hoarded antique bills in his crawl space and died trying to swallow a gold coin. Lust had been Mary Rogues, 6 lovers, all dead before her, found in her bed, whispering names that weren't her own. Now, envy, a girl who whispered to shadows and scratched symbols into her walls. But there was another layer. Each of them had once been touched, reached by something old and intelligent and utterly unfeeling. The Codex described it as the one beneath the root, a phrase scribbled dozens of times in the margins. And in a separate, shaking hand, it does not kill the sinful. It amplifies them. Isabel's room was ice cold. No vents were open.
No windows cracked.
And yet, the air stung against Ada's skin the moment she stepped inside. Wyatt followed silently, his hand lingering near his holster, not out of fear, but instinct. The kind of instinct that came from knowing something unnatural had taken root in the room. Posters of boy bands were torn down and burned in the fireplace downstairs, her mother had said. Isabel claimed they were watching her. Her shelves, once stacked with books and art supplies, had been gutted. All that remained were torn pieces of sketch paper, scribbled with symbols repeating in fractal-like sequences. Some in ink, some in blood. Ada stopped before the largest drawing, pinned to the wall above the bed. A face. Human at first glance, but the proportions were wrong. The eyes were too wide. The smile stretched past the edge of the jawline. And where the nose should have been was only a black spiral that seemed to tunnel inward the longer she looked at it. She drew this last night, Isabel's mother whispered behind them, while sleepwalking. She doesn't remember it. Has she ever drawn anything like this before? Ada asked. The woman shook her head. She used to draw animals. Forest things with light in them. Wyatt leaned closer to the drawing. There's something written along the bottom, he said. Look. The handwriting was spidery, scrawled as though by a hand trying to fight off tremors. They said I could take her life and make it mine. Ada felt her stomach lurch. She turned back to Isabel, who was now watching them through the doorway, head tilted in quiet amusement. Her lips didn't move, but a voice, raspy and ancient, spoke from her throat. She stole the boy's eyes, you know, painted them in green, wore his envy like a wedding veil. Wyatt crossed the room in 2 strides, his tone sharp. Isabel, who are you talking about? But the voice was already gone. Isabel blinked once and looked confused. Why is everyone staring at me? They didn't sleep that night. Ada and Wyatt took shifts watching over Isabel from her parents' den, one of them always awake. Neither spoke much. The fire died by 2 a.m., and a silence filled the house so deep, Ada could hear the settling of every nail in the walls. At 3:12 a.m., Isabel woke up screaming. By the time they got to her room, the mattress was soaked in green liquid, thick and viscous like bile. Her fingernails had split. Her tongue had gone black. On the wall above her bed, fresh paint had appeared, though no brush or ink was found. Envy's wish, to be her, to become her, to erase her. Isabel's mother collapsed. Wyatt called in backup. Ada didn't move. She stared at the message, remembering something from the codex, something she'd skimmed past in a rush before. A phrase hidden in a footnote beneath the entry for Envy. To see yourself in another's skin is not desire, it is hunger. That which lives beneath us does not kill, it consumes in reflection. It was happening again, one sin at a time. At dawn, Isabel tried to take her mother's face off with a pair of scissors. She screamed something in Latin as she lunged, words that sounded like glass shattering underwater. Wyatt wrestled the scissors away, but not before blood was drawn. A thin line across her mother's cheek, shallow but symbolic. Intentional. It wasn't murder. It was imitation. Ada made the call to have her transported. Quietly, no press, no records. She called an old contact in D.C., someone who owed her favors from the days she still had a badge and a life worth returning to. The girl needed containment, not punishment. And something darker still needed watching. Before they sedated Isabel, she looked at Ada and whispered, "I saw you in the mirror, wearing someone else's hands." And then she smiled, not with her lips, but with her eyes. Back at the sheriff's station, Ada sat alone in the records room. The codex was open again. She flipped back and forth, rereading the same pages. Not just the sins, but the ones who witnessed them. The Watchers, a term used for those who lived through more than one event. The margins were riddled with notes about these witnesses, always scarred, always changed, always followed. She turned to the back. There, near the binding, a small envelope had been taped shut, sealed with wax. She peeled it open with the edge of her thumbnail and unfolded the note inside. For words, handwritten in a shaking hand. "You are one now." Ada didn't sleep that night either. And outside, the rain kept falling like whispers on the glass. The storm lasted 4 more days. In that time, Isabel's condition worsened. She was transferred to a secure psychiatric wing in a neighboring county, where the nurses began reporting things they couldn't explain. Crosses turning upside down, water pooling on the ceiling, and Isabel whispering names, over and over again. Names of girls who had gone missing, and one name in particular, Clara. Ada froze when she heard it. Clara had been the first. Not just the first missing girl, but the first Ada had truly failed. 11 years old. Vanished on a warm autumn morning while walking her dog. Her body had never been found, but her red shoes washed ashore in a town 2 counties over, tied neatly together with barbed wire. Ada still had those shoes. She kept them in a box beneath her bed like a penance she could never pay in full. Wyatt leaned on the edge of her desk, watching her stare at nothing. "You all right?" "No," she tapped the codex. "It's starting again. The book, it doesn't talk about patterns. But this thing we're chasing, it's not just sin. It's strategy. Each victim builds on the last." He nodded grimly. Envy followed lust.
Yes.
And according to this, she opened to a spread of symbols shaped like fractured eyes. The next is greed. Wyatt sat heavily. What does greed want? Ada looked down at the passage and read aloud. The vessel of greed does not consume for pleasure. It consumes to leave others starving. Its joy is subtraction. The world with one less mouth fed, one more soul devoured. She flipped the page. Below the passage was a drawing, crude but unmistakable. A woman, mouth distended like a snake's, gorging herself on gold coins while children wept at her feet. Then something new caught her attention. In the corner of the page, a name had been etched in trembling pen. Marjorie Klein, 16 Orchard Avenue, May 7th. Ada's heart stopped. That was today's date. They arrived at the Klein house just before dusk. The windows were dark. The grass was long, crusted with weeds. No cars in the driveway, but someone was inside. They heard it, music, faint and warbling, from an old record player, dragging a scratched vinyl in circles. Over and over, the same line played. She'll have what you want, she'll have what you want. The door was unlocked. Wyatt led the way, flashlight raised. The smell inside was thick with rotting meat and lavender perfume. The kind of stench that layered itself behind your eyes and stayed there weeks after it faded. They moved room by room. Marjorie wasn't in her bedroom, but there were signs she'd been there. Empty jewelry boxes, a closet gutted of dresses, torn price tags on the floor. Then Ada found the mirror. Not shattered, not bloodied, but warped. The glass was soft, somehow rippled like water under pressure. And within it, faintly, a reflection not of herself, but of Clara. Clara, wearing a silk dress 3 sizes too big, face sunken and mouth sewn shut with thin wire. Ada staggered back. The mirror went still. Wyatt came rushing in. Basement. I heard something. Come on. They found Marjorie at the bottom of the stairs, kneeling, praying. Before her was a makeshift altar built from bones and porcelain dolls, all smeared with lipstick. She was whispering to them, stroking their plastic cheeks, feeding them scraps of cash and coins and ripped pieces of silk from stolen dresses. She turned when they approached, and for a moment, Ada couldn't speak. Marjorie's eyes were gone. In their place were 2 silver coins, melted into the sockets. I bought beauty, she whispered. I bartered well. Wyatt stepped forward. Put the knife down, Marjorie. But there was no knife. Instead, her hands were filled with rings. So many they'd split the skin on her fingers. I didn't want to be her, she said, voice shaking with something beyond fear. I just didn't want to be me. And then she screamed. Loud. Inhuman. A sound like copper grinding inside a furnace. Ada fired her weapon. Not at Marjorie, but at the mirror behind her, where something else was moving. A shape tall and starved and greedy, its mouth open wide enough to consume not just a face, but a soul. Glass shattered. The spell broke. And Marjorie collapsed, gasping. Still breathing. Still human. But just barely. They took her to the same facility as Isabel. Now there were 2 girls, 2 sins contained. But Ada knew what came next. There would be 5 more, and each one would hit closer. That night, she opened the codex again. The next sin was sloth. But something had changed in the book. The pages were warmer, and her name was now written beside the entry, as if the book had made a choice. Or perhaps a bargain. Chapter 7, The Quiet Room. The rain returned the night the dreams began. Not for Ada. She hadn't slept in 2 days, surviving on caffeine and gnawed pencils and something close to fear. But for Wyatt, for Dr. Benfield, for Marjorie, yes. The dreams came hard. They came like floodwater. And they all spoke of the same thing. A room. Small. Windowless. Painted pale blue and lit by an overhead bulb that never flickered. In the dream, you were always seated. You couldn't remember walking in. There was no door. No one came. But someone watched through the mirror on the wall. A mirror that showed not your reflection but what you should have been. Wyatt woke in a cold sweat, hands trembling. He didn't tell Ada. Not at first. Because in the dream, the reflection wasn't wrong. It was better. And for a brief, horrifying moment before he woke, Wyatt had wanted to stay. It started with little things. Files disappearing from Ada's desk. Forensic reports missing pages. A bloody dress, Marjorie's, that vanished from lockup without a trace. Security footage rolled blank. Computers restarted with error messages in symbols no one could read. Every time Ada opened the codex, the pages seemed wetter, soft, pulpy, like the skin of a drowned thing. And then came the letter.
Typed.
No address. Slid beneath her front door sometime in the dead of night. It read, "It's not the sins we fear. It's what they leave behind. Go to the quiet room. You've been there before." Ada didn't sleep that night either, because she had been there 30 years ago, age 5, a children's ward on the second floor of Morningside Infirmary. She remembered the nurses, smiling with dead eyes, the white walls that whispered when you got too close, and that pale blue room with the mirror, the one she'd convinced herself was a nightmare, but it hadn't been. And now someone else knew. Wyatt met her at the old hospital. Morningside had been closed for 15 years, shut down for structural disrepair after a patient burned to death in a locked wing. The city had boarded it up and let the kudzu take over. But the iron gates were still standing. So were the gargoyles on the roof, as if nothing inside had ever stopped watching. "You sure about this?" he asked, adjusting the flashlight strapped to his chest. "No," Ada said, checking her revolver. "But I don't think it matters anymore." Inside, the halls were swollen with rot and mildew. Wallpaper bubbled and peeled in ribbons. The lights, surprisingly, still worked, flickering in sporadic sections like signals from a dying star. She led them up the crumbling stairwell. Second floor, East Wing, the children's psych ward, room 206, the quiet room. They stood in front of the door a long time. Then Ada opened it.
It hadn't changed.
The room was clean, untouched. The pale blue paint still fresh somehow, though the rest of the building was rotting. A single chair sat in the middle of the floor. Above it, the overhead light buzzed but never flickered. And the mirror still there. Still wrong. But now it wasn't empty. It showed her, not as she was, but younger, age 5. Eyes too old for her face. And seated across from that version of herself was someone else entirely. Wyatt, only not him.
Thinner. Sunken.
Mouth sewn with thread. Face slack with something like grief. And they were holding hands. Ada stepped forward, heart hammering. What the hell is this? The mirror didn't answer, but the room did. It whispered, words that slithered behind the wallpaper. A voice like breath through cracked lips. "When you don't move, when you let it happen, you belong to me." The door slammed shut. The light went out, and everything else fell away. Darkness wasn't silent. It pulsed, it breathed, it watched. Ada stood still, palms slick, back to the closed door. The breath in her chest held too long. The pitch around her wasn't total, just close enough that her mind filled in the blanks with shapes it couldn't trust. Something scraped the floor beyond her reach. Something moved without footsteps. The room felt bigger now, wider, or maybe deeper, as if it had grown. Then, a whisper, inches from her ear. Not in English, not in any language she knew, but she understood it. Sloth is not sleep. It is surrender. She spun. Nothing there, but in the mirror a flicker. The version of herself in the glass now wept, mouth open in a silent scream, hands clawing at invisible restraints. And across from her, the not Wyatt figure leaned forward, whispering something too soft to hear. It placed a single hand over young Ada's mouth.
She stilled.
The light blinked on overhead. A second later, Wyatt kicked in the door. "Ada," she gasped, finally breathing again. The room returned to its old dimensions. The air went flat. The mirror planed once more. Ada stumbled into his arms. "It wanted me to stay." He looked around, pale. "There's no power in this building, Ada." She nodded, staring at the mirror. I don't think the room cares. Back in the car, Ada's fingers refused to warm. She rubbed them together, watching her own reflection in the side mirror, half expecting it to move differently than she did. Wyatt finally broke the silence. "I've seen this before," he said quietly. "My father, when he disappeared in 1984, he left a journal behind. He called it the sloth cycle. Said there's a moment in every town's reckoning where people stop fighting. They give in to the pull. They go quiet." Ada nodded, half hearing. She was staring at a note she'd found in the quiet room, folded into a seam in the wall, wedged between paint and plaster. It was written on hospital stationery, and it was signed in shaky handwriting. Clara Merritt, her little sister, gone 30 years. She opened it with trembling hands. "It's not your fault, but it has to end with you. If you see me again, don't believe it's me." Beneath it, a single drawn symbol, a circle,
A door.
a line through it. "Do not enter." Ada folded the paper and closed her eyes. Whatever this thing was, it hadn't just taken victims. It had taken faces. Later that night, the codex changed again. Ada had left it open on her kitchen table, the old pages soaked in humidity. But when she returned from the shower, a fresh page had emerged. This one handwritten, fresh ink, still drying. Sloth witness, WC marked, Merritt. Fulfillment due, one night. Failure to submit will result in replication. She reread that last word over and over. Replication. Something clicked. It didn't just feed, it duplicated. It wore you. It used you. When you broke, when you surrendered, it slipped inside the space you left behind. "Sloth," she whispered, "isn't stillness. It's vacancy." That night, Ada dreamt of the red barn again. But this time she wasn't inside it. She was it. Her thoughts were rafters and nails. Her breath came in wind that rustled old straw. Through the open loft window, she could see herself standing out in the cornfield, torchlight in hand, her face pale and blank like porcelain left out in the cold too long. Something else walked beside her. Something too tall to be Wyatt and too still to be living. She wanted to scream from her wooden lungs, from her splintered ribcage, but barns didn't scream. They just stood and waited. Then the footsteps came. Inside her, heavy, male, dragging something wet. A man with no face. Not a mask, just nothing. His body oozed with decay, but moved with purpose. He dragged a sack behind him, slung like a butcher's carry. From inside it, breath, movement, a girl's voice. "Please." The man opened the sack, reached in, and pulled out a shape that squirmed. Ada knew her. Marla Delaney, missing since 1997. He held her up by the neck, but she didn't struggle. She just whispered, "We're not lost. We're waiting for her." The barn door slammed shut. Ada woke up to blood on her kitchen floor. At first, she thought it was a nosebleed. She'd had them before when the migraines came. But the blood wasn't hers. It formed a trail, thin droplets scattered in a straight line from the front door to the table. There, seated with her head down, eyes closed, was an old woman.
Clara.
Older, frielier. Her skin hung like drapes on a drying rack, pale and splotched with mold-colored bruising. But it was her. Every detail matched the childhood photo Ada kept in her wallet. Except her lips. They were stitched shut. Thick, black sutures crisscrossed her mouth like wire fencing. Her hands lay limp in her lap, fingers stained red to the second knuckle. Ada froze. "Clara," she whispered. The head lifted slightly. The eyes flickered open. But they weren't Clara's. Not quite. Clara had never had black irises. "The house needs feeding," the woman rasped, voice coming from her throat, not her mouth. "And you were marked at birth." Ada backed toward the counter and grabbed the carving knife, then stopped herself. No weapons. No violence. That was Wrath's game, not Sloth's. "I want to help you," she said, "but I need to understand. What is the codex? What's the price?" The woman, Clara, or what was left of her, lifted her hand and pointed to the blood on the floor. It shimmered in the kitchen light and formed two words: "No rest." Then she crumpled. By the time Ada reached her, the woman was gone. Not dead.
Gone.
As if she'd never been there at all. Only the blood remained. And a single photograph on the table. A black and white image. Edevane, 1929. 7 children, all girls, standing in front of what looked like a halfway house. In the background, the same red barn. In the front row, holding a leather-bound book with a crooked key symbol on its cover, was Clara, no older than 10. In bed that night, Ada stared at the ceiling and said the words aloud. The quiet room doesn't need silence. It needs surrender. Somewhere, down deep beneath her house, something moved in response. She didn't sleep again until morning, but even then she dreamed, and this time the barn was burning, from the inside out. Chapter 8. The Sins That Sleep. They buried Father Rickman beneath the old church, same as all the others. No headstone, no marker, just the wooden crucifix nailed into the roots of the tree that grew crooked behind the vestry. Father Joseph read the rites, voice trembling with age or fear, maybe both, and the townsfolk stood scattered at a distance like salt shaken on dark cloth. Nobody had much to say, not because they didn't care, but because the words were drying up. The longer the air in Edevane sat still, the harder it was to fill it with anything living. Ada stayed at the edge of the crowd with Wyatt, both silent. The barn had burned in her dream, but here it still stood, just over the hill beyond the orchard. She could see the peak of its roof through the dying autumn trees, and the sense of wrongness crawled through her spine like something wet and patient. After the service, Wyatt lit a cigarette and spoke without looking at her. "My grandfather once told me Edevane ain't a town. Said it was a seal. A plug over a hole." Ada blinked. A hole to what? Didn't say. Just looked out toward the fields and said, "If it ever yawns, don't look inside it." That night she looked. She walked to the barn alone, carrying nothing but her father's flashlight. The police had already combed the place after Jonah Dunn's death and found nothing but rotted tools, a dead opossum, and blackened scrawl on the inside of the loft. They closed the case, called it a freak accident, chalked up the blood to animal predation. Edevane liked clean endings. It liked files and drawers and names on stones. But Ada knew better. When she opened the barn door, the air inside hit her like a memory. It was cold, stale, like something exhaled once 100 years ago and then forgotten. The flashlight flickered once, then steadied. She moved through the shadows like a diver descending a trench, every creak of the boards beneath her feet sounding like old bones giving in. The ladder to the loft still stood. She climbed it slow. When she reached the top, she found the words on the wall, scrawled in what looked like black paint but reeked like rust and old teeth. They laid with sin and slept with gods. Beneath it, a symbol, the same as on the book Clara once held in that 1929 photograph. A crooked key, threaded through a mouth sewn shut. Her breath hitched, and in the silence she heard it, a dragging sound, not in the barn but beneath it, like something large pulling itself along cold dirt. The floorboards trembled under her knees. Then a voice, not from behind her, but inside her. "The ones who rest are not at peace. They're waiting, Ada." Ada bolted from the barn, flashlight shaking in her hand, the beam slicing across the orchard like a warning light from a distant storm. She didn't remember the climb down the ladder, didn't remember crossing the threshold, only the dirt under her shoes and the strange, churning throb in her ears. It wasn't a sound. It was pressure, like something old pressing its forehead against the veil of the world, just enough to make the walls buckle. She didn't stop running until she reached the road, gasping like her lungs were rusted shut. Her car stood parked at the curve by the field, lonely under the hum of a crooked street lamp. She reached it, gripped the door handle, then froze. Across the road, standing just inside the corn, was Clara Dunn, or the shape of Clara Dunn. She wore the same clothes from the yearbook photo, yellow dress, matching bow in her hair, but her skin was gray-blue, slick like wet paper, and her eyes, they weren't eyes anymore. They were mirrors. Twin reflections of Ada's own face, twisted in disbelief. Then she opened her mouth and poured out maggots. Ada screamed, couldn't help it, and the figure vanished. Not like something running or fading, but breaking, like the air itself split and swallowed her. Sheriff Cade found her hours later sitting on the hood of her car, shaking and unblinking, covered in dirt. She didn't speak, not at first, just stared past him toward the field like it might yawn again. He drove her home, didn't ask much, just looked worried in that quiet southern way, where concern came in sideways. She called Wyatt after, told him what she'd seen, told him about the voice in the barn, the words on the wall, the girl with the maggots. Wyatt didn't laugh. "It's waking up," he said, "whatever it is. And if I had to guess, it's feeding on more than just blood." Ada swallowed. "Then what?" "Us," he said. "Our sins. One by one. Gluttony took Jonah. Lust took Marnie. Envy took Rickman. The rest, they're lining up." She remembered the 7 burned-out candles in the basement of the Dunn house. The 7 knives, well, 6 now, laid out in a circle of salt and mold. Each one engraved with a name, each one holding a secret. Wyatt kept talking, lower now. "There's a reason no one leaves Edevane. You ever noticed that?" She had. Everyone she knew who tried to leave came back. Or vanished. Her Uncle Roy moved to Atlanta in '95. Shot himself 6 weeks later. Her cousin Trish went to college in Spokane. Vanished off the grid in the 2nd semester. Missing person flyers, local news, then nothing. Wyatt said, "You don't get to outrun your sin. Not when something's keeping score." That night, Ada found herself alone again. She stood in the shower with the lights off, letting the water scald her until the tiles steamed. She didn't want to feel clean. She wanted to feel alive. But instead, she felt eyes behind her back. Every time she blinked, the mirror fogged with shapes she didn't understand. At midnight, the power flickered out. She lit candles, sat in the kitchen, and then the phone rang, an old landline she hadn't used in years. She lifted the receiver with a hand that didn't feel like hers. A voice, ragged with static, whispered, "You sleep, but I watch. You breathe, but I feed."
Click.
She dropped the phone, backed up into the counter, heart pounding like hooves on wet ground. Then came a knock at the door.
Slow.
Deliberate. 3 times. She didn't answer. The knocking stopped. She stood there for what felt like forever, waiting, listening. And then a voice, familiar, fragile, sifted through the door. "Ada, it's me. It's Clara. Please. I'm so cold." But Ada had seen her mouth full of death. And even though her body trembled, even though part of her wanted to believe the lie, wanted to open the door and let the nightmare in, she didn't move. Because now she knew the truth. Whatever was pretending to be Clara wasn't outside anymore. It was already inside the town, inside the people, inside her. The next morning came slow and colorless, like a photograph fading under sunlight. Ada hadn't slept. She sat at the kitchen table still wearing the same clothes from the night before, eyes glassy, palms raw from gripping the flashlight too hard. The silence in the house was complete. No pipes, no wind, no birds. Like the world was holding its breath. She knew what she had to do. She called Wyatt, told him to meet her at the Dunn place again. Said she was done hiding, done pretending this was just superstition, just trauma. He didn't argue, just said, half hour, and hung up. When they reached the Dunn house, the barn door was wide open. Neither of them had left it that way. The inside smelled different this time, less like dust, more like rot. Ada moved first, holding a crowbar in her right hand, flashlight in the left. Wyatt had his old .38 revolver, the one he'd kept since the force. Neither of them expected it to help. They were way past bullets and boards now. In the loft, the candles were burned out completely. The wall with the sigils had blackened, warped like it had been burned from inside the wood. And there, where the knives had been laid out, were now 5. 2 were missing. "It's happening faster now," Wyatt murmured. "It's claiming them." Ada stepped closer. She could see it now. Each knife wasn't just engraved. It was alive. The metal pulsed faintly, like the glow of embers under coals.
She leaned in.
On the 5th blade, the name etched across the spine was one she hadn't seen before. Her breath caught. It read, "Ada Whitlock." Wyatt saw it too. "It's marked you." "No," she whispered. "It's wrong. It can't be me." "You sure?" he asked softly. That hit harder than any ghost ever could, because Ada wasn't sure. She remembered what she did in college, the boy she left behind after the accident, the friend who took the fall. She remembered telling herself it was survival. But it wasn't. It was pride, cold, sharpened, and willing to cut. 5 sins taken, Wyatt said. 2 left. And now it wants you. Ada turned, rage boiling through her panic. "Then we don't run anymore. We finish this. Whatever's inside those blades, whatever's waiting in this dirt, we burn it." But even as she said it, the barn groaned above them. The rafters flexed. Dust rained down like ash. And something began moving in the dark spaces just beyond their light, skittering like bone against stone. Wyatt raised the flashlight. "You feel that?"
Ido.
I think we woke it up. The floor of the loft trembled. A low moan crept up from underneath, not human, but close enough to chill the spine. "Go," Wyatt said. "I'll buy you time."
No.
We both. He shoved her hard, sent her stumbling toward the ladder. "Go!" She dropped down the rungs, half climbing, half falling, just as something crashed through the boards above. A black shape made of smoke and ragged whispers, its limbs too long, too jointless. It bled from nowhere. It hissed without breath. Wyatt fired.
Once. Twice.
A 3rd shot exploded like a flare as Ada hit the ground and sprinted out into the field. She didn't look back. Didn't want to see what price Wyatt paid for giving her a few extra seconds. By the time she reached the tree line, the barn was aflame. Orange split the sky like a scream. Black smoke curled upward, and deep inside the fire, she swore she saw faces. Not just Wyatt's, but Rickman's, Clara's, Jonah's, Marnie's. All 7 of them, flickering in the heat like souls caught in limbo. Then she realized. The barn wasn't burning from the outside. It was burning from beneath, from inside the earth. Something had been buried under Edevane for a long, long time, and now was clawing up through the roots, through the memories, through the sins. That night, Ada returned to her home and locked every door. She turned off all the lights, sat in the center of the living room with a flashlight and her crowbar and waited for morning. But dawn never came. Instead, her phone buzzed. 1 text. No number. Just a name. Wrath. And below it, a single image. The inside of her barn. And Wyatt's hat, alone in the ashes. Chapter 9. The Harvest of Teeth. Edevane had gone silent. Not the kind of silence that settled after a snowfall, or when the power died for the night. This was a listening silence. A breath held across miles. Even the insects had stopped. The wind had forgotten how to move. And the sky, gray as wet stone, hadn't changed for 2 days. The sun never quite rose, and the night never really fell. Time itself had gotten strange. as if the world was leaning slightly towards something it didn't yet understand. Ada Whitlock stood at the edge of the Ashbury Fields, flashlight off, her breath fogging. The soil beneath her boots was soft, like something had been tunneling. The earth was giving way. Not all at once, but slowly, inexorably, like it was ready to crack open and spill its secrets. The message had come again. This time, not a name, just an audio clip, less than 10 seconds. She listened to it 12 times before she stopped crying. Then she loaded her father's shotgun and started walking. It had been Wyatt's voice, garbled and dry, like it had clawed its way out of a dirt-packed throat. It's still hungry, Ada. Don't come for me. Then a sharp crack. And chewing.
No static.
Just chewing. She moved past the edge of town, where the ruins of the Whitlock Mill sat slumped against the tree line. What once was a proud fixture of her family's name was now just rot and rust, riddled with graffiti and mold. Ada wasn't coming here to remember. She was coming here to bury something. She descended through a narrow hatch at the back, where the workers used to take breaks in the cooling room below the main floor. It smelled like mildew and old paper. But more than that, it smelled like dirt, fresh dirt, the kind that should have been part of a grave. And there they were.
Teeth. Dozens of them.
Laid out in a circle. Baby teeth, molars, canines. All clean and glinting under the flashlight like coins. Something had arranged them. Each one was labeled, scratched into the concrete in red marker. Clara Jonah Marnie Rickman Ada. Her name again. And this time it wasn't etched into steel or scratched onto wood. It was written in blood. She knelt and touched one of the teeth. It was cold. It pulsed. And then something beneath the concrete scraped. She leapt back. The floor bulged, just for a second, then split, a jagged crack racing outward from the circle of teeth. A hand reached through, thin, gnarled, skin like burned parchment, and it dropped a single object onto the floor before vanishing again into the dark. Wyatt's wedding band. Ada staggered back, heart pounding, while burning her throat. The ring lay perfectly centered in the teeth circle, like an offering, or a demand. She didn't need lore books to understand anymore. Edevane had never just been cursed, it had been promised to something. Bartered. Each sin, each name carved, was a debt paid late. And now that thing beneath the town, beneath the houses, beneath her own life, was collecting interest. The town was its barn. The people were its crops. And the teeth were its harvest. By the time Ada returned to her truck, the wind had picked up, but not from any direction she could place. It stirred the dust in strange patterns, lifting leaves without trees and bending shadows that didn't have shapes. The air smelled of iron and cellar rot. She drove with one hand on the wheel, the other gripping the old shotgun laid across the passenger seat. Wyatt's ring sat beside it, glowing faintly under the dull cabin light. She hadn't touched it since the mill, not because she feared it, but because it was still warm. Edevane's main street was abandoned. Not closed, not quiet, abandoned. Doors hung half open. Lights blinked in windows, unblinking. A dog sat in the middle of the road chewing something it hadn't killed. When Ada rolled past it, it didn't even flinch. The sheriff's office was dark, save for the desk lamp in Deputy Gray's corner. He didn't look up when she came in. Gray. Nothing. She stepped forward, boots clicking on tile. Gray. She froze. His skin was pale, too pale, and his shirt was wet with something black where his stomach should have been. His eyes were open, unmoving, glossed over like river stones. But he was still breathing. Not fast, not slow, just a steady in-out hiss, like the bellows of something deeper, older. And then, from behind her, "Don't wake him." Ada turned, shotgun raised. Sheriff Delaney stood in the hallway shadows, her badge crooked, one sleeve torn. "What the hell is happening?" Ada asked. Delaney's face looked hollowed out, her cheekbones too sharp, her eyes rimmed with red, like she hadn't slept in days, or maybe longer. "He heard the voice," Delaney said. "Same one you did. It's using the people now, the ones closest to the edge. They open themselves to it. Let it in." Let what in? Gluttony was just the start. Ada swallowed. "Each sin needs its vessel," Delaney said. "Each one needs to be witnessed. I don't believe in demons." "Good. This ain't one." Then Delaney did something Ada would never forget. She rolled up her sleeve and showed her arm. The veins weren't veins anymore. They were teeth. Tiny, translucent teeth, bulging beneath her skin like larvae. "It's growing in me," she whispered. "Started in the dreams. Then the cravings. Now I can hear it chewing when I breathe." Ada took a step back. "You're not. I'm still me.
For now.
But I can feel it pushing." "Why are you telling me this?" "Because it wants you next.
Wants you to see what it looks like.
Wants you to name it." Ada's flashlight dimmed. Somewhere down the hallway, behind the holding cells, there was a wet, scratching sound, like someone filing a tooth. Ada gripped the shotgun tight. "You need to burn the records," Delaney said. "Every file, every name carved into those boxes. Burn them all." "And then what?" Delaney looked her straight in the eye. "Then you run." Ada didn't run. She should have. She thought about it. Hell, every part of her screamed for it. But something held her there, rooted in the quiet rot of the Edevane sheriff's office. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was guilt. Or maybe it was the sick certainty that if she left now, she'd never wake up right again. Delaney disappeared into the back of the building without another word. The way she walked, jerky, uneven, almost like her bones didn't fit her skin, told Ada everything she needed to know. The sheriff wasn't going to make it to morning. Whatever had gotten in her was chewing fast. The silence in the building was thick, like wet wool. Somewhere beyond the cells, the scratching had stopped. Ada waited for it to start again, and when it didn't, that felt worse. She moved toward the evidence room. The records sat in gray file boxes labeled with fading black ink. Incident: March 1972. Domestic dispute. O'Shea Farm. Unsolved number 14. Bleeding man in orchard. Her father's handwriting marked the corners of more than one.
This wasn't just about now.
It never had been. The town was sick with it, rotted from the roots up, and her family, her father, her grandfather before him, they'd been tending to the infection like gardeners. Each sin had a vessel, each sin a witness. She pulled open the steel cabinet and stared at the top drawer. Inside, brittle papers, photographs gone gray with time, wax-sealed baggies with buttons, rings, teeth. One envelope was stamped with the words Morrigan case, archived by request. She opened it. Inside was a photo of a girl.
Blonde.
Maybe 15. Eyes so wide they didn't look human. Ada recognized her. The same face from the grain silo. On the back of the photo, in her father's looping scrawl, gluttony confirmed, deed accepted. And below it, 6 vessels remained. Ada stepped back, heart thudding against her ribs like it wanted out. The door behind her creaked. She turned. Delaney stood in the frame, barefoot, blood smeared down her chin. Her left eye was gone, just an empty socket weeping something thick and milky. But her mouth, God help her, her mouth was full of new teeth. Too many for a human skull. They jutted from her gums like quartz formations, overlapping, tearing at the inside of her cheeks every time she moved. "You shouldn't have read it," Delaney said through the blood. Ada raised the shotgun. What happened to the deputy? Delaney smiled, or tried to. He fed it. He always was greedy. Ada fired. The blast sent Delaney reeling back against the wall, but it didn't drop her. Something inside her shifted. The skin around her shoulders bulged, tore slightly, and through the rips, Ada could see something pulsing. Not muscle, not bone. Something trying to be both. Delaney screamed, but it wasn't all pain. There was hunger in the sound. Ada ran, down the hall, through the front doors, into the rising dark. The sky above Edevane had turned the color of clotted cream. Clouds swirled like water around a drain. Crows circled in tight spirals, low enough to reach. One of them fell dead at her feet, its belly split and empty. She didn't stop to look. She gunned the truck and tore down Main Street, past the diner, the flower shop, the gas station with the always broken pump. The wind was behind her now, pushing hard. The air tasted of salt and copper and something older. Ada didn't know where she was going. She only knew what she had to do. Burn the past, break the chain, and never stop moving. Because something had been let loose in Edevane. Something that had been waiting for generations. And it had only just begun to feed. Let me know when you're ready to begin Chapter 10, the final chapter. Chapter 10, The Devil That Waits Beneath. Edevane wasn't sleeping anymore. Every house on Maple, Sycamore, and Court Street had its lights on. Naked bulbs in attics, televisions playing snow, porch lights flickering like eyelids twitching in a nightmare. The people inside weren't moving. They weren't hiding either. They just sat. Faces turned toward the windows like they were waiting for something to arrive. A signal.
A sound.
A reckoning. Ada watched from the ridge above town, crouched in the tall dead grass behind the crumbling stone wall of the old McGrady orchard. The engine of her father's truck ticked softly beside her. She hadn't turned it off out of fear. She wouldn't get it started again. Beneath her, the valley shuddered faintly, like a breath being held. The sins were moving. She knew that now, not just in concept or as a convenient metaphor for bad people doing bad things. They were alive. They fed. They passed from body to body, generation to generation. Her father had tracked them. Her grandfather before him. All of them quietly pruning the wicked like farmers tending to diseased crops. But they never cured anything. They just trimmed back the symptoms. And the rot always returned. This time it was different. This time the host, the town itself, was refusing to cooperate. Ada reached into the glove box and pulled out the old field journal again. Her father's entries were beginning to make sense now, if only in the way that madness sometimes mimics logic. 7 vessels, 7 sins, each confirmed by a deed, each given weight by an act of violence, a moment of indulgence. She flipped to the final pages, a name she hadn't noticed before. Ada, inheritor.
Pride.
Her stomach turned cold. Her hands didn't shake. Not anymore. Because in some awful part of herself, she already knew. She had come back to save the town. She had come back because she thought only she could fix it. She thought she was better than them. She thought she wasn't infected. Somewhere down in town, a scream split the stillness. A woman's scream, high and long, broken halfway through like her throat had torn open under the force of it. Ada turned the key, the engine revved, and the truck lurched forward. She passed through the outskirts like a stranger. The street signs looked like gravestones now, rusted, leaning, inscribed with names no one alive remembered. She drove past them all. The ruin of the school where wrath had once bled through the walls, the old sawmill where sloth made its home in dust and silence, and the house where her mother died, where pride had nested inside a smile. By the time she reached the center of town, the scream had stopped. The people hadn't moved.
They stood now.
In the doorways, on porches, in yards, barefoot, blank-faced, like mannequins posed mid-exit, all looking in the same direction, toward the church. Ada parked and stepped out into the thick, waiting air. The church bells were ringing. She hadn't heard them in 20 years. The last time they'd rung was the day after her mother died. And now they tolled again, slow and deep, like something buried was knocking from below. She walked toward them, shotgun in one hand, her father's field journal in the other. The church doors were open. Inside, the pews were packed. Every resident in town, silent, wide-eyed, each mouth sewn shut, not with thread, but with something else. Something darker, something willing. And at the pulpit stood Delaney, or what was left of her.
She'd changed.
Grown tall and pale and angular. Her hands ended in claws. Her jaw split wider than it should have, lined with too many teeth. The whites of her eyes were gone, replaced with shifting oil. And from her chest spilled smoke, curling in slow, deliberate spirals that whispered in voices no living thing should understand. "Ada," she said, "you've come to bear witness." Ada stepped into the aisle. "I came to end it." The thing in Delaney smiled. "You are it." Ada raised the shotgun. The bells rang again, and the sky opened. The sky didn't crack open like glass, it peeled. A seam split across the firmament over Edevane, as though some colossal zipper had been tugged by an invisible hand. Light bled through, not golden or divine, but a sickly blue, like lightning caught behind skin. The clouds rolled away, not by wind, but as if something vast and slow-moving was crawling beneath them, warping the sky with every breath. The people in the pews did not look up. They hummed, low, guttural, harmonious. Delaney raised her hands, or the thing that had taken her shape did. Her arms stretched like they were boneless, her skin paper-thin, and marked with the sigils Ada had seen in her father's journal, a looping script, ancient, repetitive, seared into flesh like brands. "You're not a savior," Delaney said calmly. "You're the last of the seven." Ada's fingers clenched around the shotgun's grip. She wasn't shaking. She wanted to shake. She should have been shaking. But something colder than fear had settled into her ribs. "I've seen what the rest became," she said. "Greed, lust, envy. I buried wrath myself." "And yet," Delaney said, stepping down from the pulpit, bare feet touching the marble like an animal stalking prey, "you continue to believe your will matters. That's the sin in you, Ada.
Pride.
The first sin, the source. All others descend from you." The humming in the pews grew louder. The air began to tremble, not from sound, but from pressure, like the atmosphere itself was buckling around the church. "You think you can end this with violence?" Delaney laughed. "That's what your father thought. That's what your grandfather thought. So they hunted and they cut and they buried. And yet we're still here, stronger than ever. Because this," she gestured to the church, the sky, the town, "is not rot. It's a rebirth." Ada's shotgun barked. Delaney's chest exploded in a mist of black fluid. The impact knocked her back, limbs flailing like a marionette with its strings cut. She slammed against the altar, crumpling into a pile of slick skin and bones. The humming faltered. Ada stepped forward, pumping another shell into the chamber. "I don't believe in saviors," she whispered, "but I believe in endings." Delaney stood up.
There was no hole in her chest.
Her face had changed again, her jaw now unhinged entirely, her eyes a blank, lidless white. Her skin stretched with seams where something larger pressed beneath. "I remember your mother," Delaney hissed. She begged, "Not for her life, for yours." Because even then, she could see the stain in your soul. Ada fired again. Delaney didn't fall this time. The shot hit, but it passed through her like smoke. And in that moment, Ada understood the truth. Delaney wasn't the source. She was the mouthpiece, the vessel, the thing in the sky, the thing reaching through the split heavens. That was what needed feeding. 7 sins, 7 vessels, 7 rituals to crack the seal. And Ada, she was the last offering, the final nail in the town's coffin, the center of the circle. Delaney surged forward, too fast, too fluid. Her limbs didn't move. They slithered through the air. The pews erupted as the congregation rose in perfect unison, mouths tearing open with bloodless smiles, their humming becoming a chant. Ada dropped the shotgun and ran. She pushed through the doors of the church as the first tendrils of smoke curled after her, thick as ropes, pulling behind them the screams of something trying to be born.
She didn't look back.
The road out of Edevane didn't exist anymore. Ada found herself standing at the crossroads where Route 23 used to run straight through the hills. But now, the blacktop dissolved into bone-white dust, vanishing into a thicket of dead trees that hadn't been there yesterday, or even an hour ago. Behind her, the church was groaning. Not creaking, groaning, like a throat stretched too wide. The bell tolled without clappers, without wind. The sound rang through the air like something final, a countdown at the end of time. Ada fell to her knees, the breath torn from her chest. The land knew her name. The sky whispered it. Her bloodline had always been a lock on the door, not the key to save it. Her grandfather hadn't just failed. He had helped shape the ritual. Her father hadn't resisted out of righteousness. He had resisted out of fear, and fear only buys time. Now, there was none left. The sin had always been pride, not the vain kind, the ancestral kind. The belief that knowledge made one clean, that killing monsters made one different from them. But Delaney's words echoed now, brutal and true. You are the last. Ada stood, slowly, painfully. The shotgun was gone. Everything was gone, save the locket around her neck, the one her mother had given her when she was 6, just before she disappeared under the floorboards of the mill. Inside it was a picture of a woman smiling too softly to be happy. Beneath the photo, in tiny scrawled letters, "You will carry it, or it will carry you." Ada looked toward the town. It was no longer a Edevane. It was a mouth, yawning wide in the land itself. The buildings folded in on themselves like paper, revealing black spirals beneath. Windows were now eyes. Lamplight flickered in Morse that her bones could read. Come home.
Come home. Come home.
The sky above peeled open further. A shape pushed through. It wasn't the kind of thing one sees. It was a suggestion of form. A silhouette drawn in reverse lightning. All sharp edges and hunger. 7 limbs. A torso made of faces, each contorted in a different sin. At its heart, the church, the people of Edevane, what was left of them, stood in a ring around it, arms raised, throats open in soundless screams. They had been feeding this thing their sins for decades, perhaps centuries, and now it wanted her, the last sin. Ada turned back once toward the hills, the trees. There was still a path through the woods if she ran fast, hard, far enough. But that would be the same mistake they all made. Her father, her grandfather, leave it for someone else. Another generation, another girl to carry the curse. Not this time. Ada walked back, step by step, toward the church. As she passed the people in the circle, they did not stop her. Their eyes did not follow. Their minds had gone, emptied out like soup pots scraped dry. Vessels, every one. Delaney waited on the altar. Her form was no longer human. She stood like a marionette made from smoke and wire, her voice a shriek inside Ada's skull. You return. Why? Ada took the locket from her neck and held it high. Because someone has to shut the door. Delaney laughed. It was not a sound a woman should be able to make. But the locket had begun to glow. Not bright, not clean. It pulsed like a heartbeat, synced to Ada's own. Her mother's words returned. You will carry it, or it will carry you. She bit down on the metal until it broke. The scream that followed wasn't hers. There was light, not holy, not divine, just fire, the kind that eats forests and spares no bones. It surged up from the ground where Ada had bitten through the chain, through her mouth, her throat, her veins. She could feel it boiling every sin she'd ever held in her skin. Every rage, every guilt, every ounce of pride that had told her she could.
Beat this.
It burned her clean, and then burned her away. The creature in the sky screeched. The church shook. The people dropped. Their bodies unraveled like paper dolls torn in a gale. The altar cracked. The sigils screamed. The ground split and the light poured in. And then the sky stitched shut. After, it rained in Edevane for 7 days. When the rescue crews came through, what little there was no church. No records of a woman named Delaney Wells. No congregants. No blood. Just a field of ash and a single silver locket buried in the mud. Inside it, a photo of a woman smiling too softly to be happy. And the inscription,
She chose to carry it.